The Second Opinion Roundtable was filmed with a special 360-degree camera. To follow along with the discussion in the video above, use your cursor to click and drag in the direction of the panelist who is speaking, or click on the directional arrows in the top left corner of the video player. Unfortunately, Safari doesn't support 360 video. Please use Chrome or the YouTube app on an iPhone. David Skorton. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this first session of Second Opinion, an ongoing series where the Smithsonian is attempting to convene conversations among interesting people with interesting points of view and interesting experiences, on issues that we believe are of national importance. For our conversation today, we're going to address an issue that is of concern to all of us and each of us: the state of our planet, given the impact on the planet, of the rise of the human species, the dawn of agriculture, increasing land and water use, emerging infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases, climate change, species extinction, and other challenges. Is there a reason to be optimistic about the future of our planet, and our place on it? Will our species have the ideas and means, and the will, to successfully adapt to this upcoming era of change, and to alter its course for the better? Here to discuss this question with me is a very esteemed group of interesting people. I'm David Skorton. I'm the Secretary of the Smithsonian. And going to my left, I will introduce the different people around here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how you can learn more about the wonderful work that they've done. I'll tell you that in just a moment. To my immediate left is Denise G. Fairchild, who's president of the Emerald Cities Collaborative. It's a national nonprofit organization working to ensure equity inclusion, while building resilient green and healthy economies. To her left is Steve Monfort, who is the John and Adrienne Mars Director and Chief Scientist at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. And Steve is also the Deputy Director of the Smithsonian's National Zoological Park. To his left is Mary Evelyn Tucker. She's co-director of the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale University, where she teaches in the Joint Master's Program between the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and the Divinity School. Next to Mary Evelyn is Anson Hines, who goes by Tuck, and he's the director of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. Next to Tuck is Katrina Roark, who is the Senior Fellow for Energy Policy at the R Street Institute, a free market think tank, advancing solutions to complex public policy problems. And between Katrina and me is Jedediah Purdy, who goes by Jed, professor of law at Duke University, and the author of After Nature, A Politics for the Anthropocene. Now, I welcome you to dig deeper into the individual works of these panels, which can be found on our Second Opinion website. Well, thank you very much everyone for being a part of this. And I also want to point out that we have an audience of very interesting people as well all around us, and you will have a chance perhaps to hear some of their questions later on. So, let's start by a quote from Katrina. And this quote that Katrina has written: "The globe is indeed warming, and we are largely responsible." Well, the Smithsonian Institution a few years ago issued a statement to that same effect, saying, "The global climate is warming as a result of human activities." Yet despite this general overall scientific consensus, there remains continuing need to understand more about the exact details of what the warming of the planet will mean for the world and human civilization, and over what time period. Tuck, I'm going to throw the first one to you. Tell us a bit about what you see as the challenges ahead, for getting a better understanding of the impact of this undeniable climate change. Tuck Hines, thanks. It's very clear, the science is very clear, that the planet is warming, and that this is a result of rising carbon dioxide, which has a fingerprint of coming from burning of fossil fuels. There's no doubt about that. The trend for that has been well established and is projected into the future. What's important to understand is the role of science and the uncertainty of the implications for that in our social and economic systems, and the interactions of the many factors that enormous change to the planet is causing. Interactions with food production systems, with weather, with plant growth, with rising sea level, all of those things vary enormously across the planet, and interact with each other, and there's a real need for research to understand those interactive factors as an important next step, not in denying the positive direction of the climate warming, but the consequences of that, and how that will play out. David Skorton, thanks a lot, Tuck. Speaking of research and studies in the human psyche, there are numerous psychological studies that suggest, and somewhat paradoxically, that the more evidence people see in certain situations that a particular belief they hold is incorrect, the more they may actually dig in and hold on to the idea that that belief is true. Denise, I want to challenge you with this one, if I could. What can you tell us, from your career, are the challenges you've seen getting large groups of individuals, entire societies even, to change their minds about a particular aspect of the world, such as climate change, and further change their behavior? Denise Fairchild, well, thank you for the question. Actually, I do believe we're seeing sort of a mind shift, an idea shift happening in America, if not the globe. I mean, to the extent that we have had the Paris Climate Accord, for example, that represents nations around the world, for the first time, recognizing that there is a problem. Note, this conversation took place before President Trump announced that the United States would withdraw from the Paris Accord. That's been 25 years in the make to get to that point, that nation-states are recognizing that there's a problem, something to do about it. The fact that we can actually see low-income communities of color, now, often the environmental movement is seen as a middle-class, white movement. But to this day, all the research points to the fact that low-income communities of color care about, and want to do something about, climate change, even greater than middle-class, white communities. It means that these are very fundamental issues that people care about. I think what needs to happen at this stage is sort of figuring out, what are the tools that people need to actually make a difference. So people are doing things, like making their homes more energy efficient. People are moving towards solar energy. Folks are preserving and improving how they conserve water, and they don't turn on their washing machines in the middle of the day, or their dishwashers. So just gradually the knowledge is disseminating across the globe, and particularly in the United States, where people are making individual behavioral changes. The thing that I think is a fundamental challenge, however, is looking at the structural causes of climate change, and how we get people to understand that we are part of the problem in terms of mass production and mass consumption. You talked about greenhouse gas emissions and carbon and the burning of fossil fuels. Well, that's fueled by an economic model that supports an extractive economy in digging up the oils and all the fossil fuels. The question becomes, how do we get out of the cultural mindset that we have to have more stuff, and we have to produce more stuff, and we have to consume more stuff, that just continues to drive the conditions that cause climate change? That's the fundamental issue. That's the behavioral changes that need to be made at the personal level. Often the environmental movement is seen as a middle-class, white movement. But to this day, all the research points to the fact that low-income communities of color care about, and want to do something about, climate change, even greater than middle-class, white communities. Denise Fairchild, David Skorton, it's a tall order. It sounds right to me, and I'm sure that we can solve this problem during our discussion. Denise Fairchild, absolutely. There's no question. David Skorton, following along on to what you mentioned about the role of individuals, some people continue to argue that the U.S., the government itself, the federal government, can and should play a greater role in helping to direct large-scale initiatives for the greater good in a whole variety of areas, among them building infrastructure, addressing social inequalities, undertaking scientific research. Katrina, you've worked a lot in that area, the interface between individuals and the government. What are the challenges in your observation, in getting governments to address the looming changes ahead? And while you're thinking about that, should any governmental initiative be at the federal level, or should it be at the local level, or state level, or both? Katrina Roark. That's a complicated and maybe loaded question. I think that policies are best designed by people closest to problems. So, in this pending debate over infrastructure spending, we're seeing some contest between who's going to make decisions about how any future dollars get spent. Will it be at the federal level, or are we going to devolve decision-making to the cities? I think it's a nice way of looking at public policy problems generally, because in individual communities we can identify problems that we find to be more pressing much more immediately and with better data and narratives than a federal government could. I do think that finding the right stages of implementation for policy decisions is really important, even for subjects like global climate change, which affect us as a global population, and not individual populations. But I also think it's important to note that the government is not the root of cures for every public policy problem. Often we find cures and innovations in individual communities, and the creativity of humans is what leads to solutions, not the ingenuity of a bureaucrat. And so one of the things that we work on at R Street is, how do we identify a way to make the footprint of government small enough to allow this intellectual curiosity to lead us to solutions at the same time that we don't ignore significant market failures, where there is a compelling need for government to intercede? Without answering your question specifically, because I think that would take about 6 hours of conversation, I think what we're looking at in the subject of climate change, but in these global problems more broadly, is a way to mobilize individuals and communities, and then take that information and do great things with it, rather than having decisions come from some centralized power. Government is not the root of cures for every public policy problem. Often we find cures and innovations in individual communities, and the creativity of humans is what leads to solutions, not the ingenuity of a bureaucrat. Katrina Roark. David Skorton. Very, very interesting. And as a lifelong bureaucrat I take that in a very positive sense. I love that title. Following along your line of thinking, it's been suggested over the years that sometimes individuals don't always make the right decision in their own interest, even if that decision is made close to the action. And in the 60s, I'm looking around the table here. Some of you may still remember the 60s perhaps. Tuck, put your hand down. In the 60s, the ecologist Garrett Hardin, you may remember this, published the essay on the tragedy of the commons, which has been used in many different areas of endeavor and thought. And he pointed out, for those who are just learning about this, that there are some situations where people, even acting apparently in their own self-interest, will engage in behaviors that in the end collectively affect their own self-interest in the wrong direction, negatively. And he used as an example shepherds who were having their sheep graze and eventually perhaps overgraze and destroying an area, making it barren, and therefore hurting their own self-interest. You could argue, I suppose, that the current dilemma that we're in terms of the climate, is another example of a commons, where people and nations act in their own interest, apparently, but eventually you wind up creating a result that is much worse for them in the end. Jed, I'm wondering if you could tell us what you think are some of the challenges in overcoming this. If it really is under tragedy of the commons, what's your thought on that? Jedediah Purdy. David, thank you. I think it is a commons tragedy. I think it is the largest and most general that we've ever faced. It threatens to be the commons tragedy that ate the world really, and precisely because it's so global. I think it confounds many of our ordinary expectations about how we ought to address even the most complex problems. Katrina, I think of what you just said about the need for solutions to come from those who are closest to the problem. One of the characteristics, I think, of global climate change is it can often be difficult to see who it is exactly, who is closest to the problem, right, in its various stages and its complex interrelations. I'd also just say, and one further note of piling on pessimism, before I try to turn a little bit constructive, that it's not just a collective action problem across individuals or across nations in the present, which is clearly right. It's also a commons tragedy across generations, because each generation can in a narrow, rational sense act in its own interest, while putting the cost of dealing with the consequences of what it's done on those who come after. So in that sense, the people making the decisions are always the ones who can least be counted on to do the right thing. I think of this as pointing in two directions. On one level, I want to sort of echo and amplify and generalize what Denise said a little bit ago, about the need for change on the level of behavior and even consciousness. This has to invite an answer where we change our understanding of what problems are ours, and what interests are ours. One of the things I find hopeful in the history of environmental thought and action is that it's often involved people reimagining their place in the world, revisiting the question, who are you connected to? Which problems are yours? Is it in your interest to save something that you can't immediately use? And we think about these questions, we actually live these questions very differently than people once did. That seems hopeful. But I would also say, and I don't think anyone has said the contrary, but I just emphasize, changes of consciousness on the individual level have to be turned into legal and political structures that people can rely on, and live by. That was the conclusion of Garrett Hardin's famous article that you began with, that we needed what he called mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, to control access to the commons. So I think a political expression and reinforcement of a changing consciousness will be equally important. David Skorton, thoughts about that? Yes, Mary Evelyn Tucker, if I could build on that? Thank you. David Skorton, please. Mary Evelyn Tucker, and for these other comments as well. I think this is very critical, because the way I would see it is, we have a great value in the last 200+ years of Enlightenment thinking, of individualism, liberty, equality and fraternity. But individualism and innovation is terrific, and Katrina, I agree with that. But I think we're also at a point of hyper-individualism, where we haven't really acknowledged what is a community-building way of being in the world. This is one of the great characteristics of humans, we can build communities. So I think we need from individualism to interdependence, independence to interdependence, from equality to equity, about how these issues have affected so many people, Native Americans, African Americans, Latinos out of the picture, and fraternity. We really need to claim the grounds that says, we are in this together, for children, for intergenerations and so on. And I think that is one of our greatest challenges, that we'll have consequences for structures and politics, but that the individual sphere is, I think, being almost suffocated by hyper-consumption and hyper-individualism. We yearn to be part of something larger, and call to something larger, which is why this conversation is so important. We really need to claim the grounds that says, we are in this together, for children, for intergenerations. And I think that is one of our greatest challenges. Mary Evelyn Tucker, Denise Fairchild, and I would also suggest that this notion of the commons is nothing new. I think this hyper-individualism is something that's only been within the makings of the Western economies, and then we can look to indigenous cultures where the commons was how people lived. We look at our Native American community, for example. They say you make decisions, Jed, to your point, based on 7 generations, 2 in the past, the current generation, and 4 generations going forward, which gives you a sense of the intergenerational nature of this, that we are one, and part of an ecosystem, and we cannot just see ourselves as consuming or producing for me and myself and mine, but that we are making decisions for the globe, for the part that we have in the entire ecosystem. So, I think there are places that there's a sense of optimism, places where we can look, cultures that we can look to, that really give us the pathway towards a different kind of way to live in this climate challenge that we're facing. David Skorton, very interesting. And is it a practical thing, or do we have a moral obligation, would you say, looking at you, Mary Evelyn, to think about future generations? Are we just being pragmatic, or is there a moral aspect to it? Mary Evelyn Tucker, well, pragmatism has its role, for sure. But I think that the moral call, and I know Jed would share this, and many of us here, I think is very profound, and your point to other cultures. I study Confucianism, the oldest ongoing culture and civilization in the world, now in its hyper-development phase. But the idea of Confucianism is, even the character for the individuals is an individual in relationship to others. And the idea, even for public service, is you're doing this for the common good. It's a completely different way of being human in the world. And there's a revival of Confucianism for reasons of overconsumption, over-individualism, and a spiritual vacuum. So in short, I think there is a complex multifaceted moral call at this moment in human history that needs to draw on other cultures, other religions, other peoples and races and so on, to build what I would call a multicultural, but planetary civilization, for the future. I think we can do that. Jedediah Purdy, if I might just add one note to what Mary Evelyn says. The distinction between pragmatic and moral motivations is useful, but in some ways it's also an artifact of our rather individualistic conception of what it is to act as a person. David Scorton, these are the points I was hoping you would bring out, and I'd appreciate my other colleagues bringing out points that I'd like you to bring out. The last thing you just said, thinking about the planet broadly, I'd like to talk a little bit about species beyond the human species. It's been suggested that one of the biggest impacts of climate change, some of the things that Tuck said we have to pay attention to, is the growing extinction of other species around the globe. Steve, you have spent a very distinguished career working in this area, but for those of us who haven't thought about this, why worry about it? Why does a diverse population of animals or plants matter to us or to the Earth in general? Steve Monfort, I think it's a great question. I often, since climate change came onto the horizon over the last decade or so, and was in front of everybody's mind, it sort of cast a pall, I think, over everyone feeling there's this sense of gloom and doom, and what can I do about the climate? What can I do about the atmosphere, and so forth. But, there's another effect, and the effect has been that all of the funding, a lot of the attention shifted away from biodiversity and functioning ecosystems to now a sense of what do we do about the climate? I guess I feel there's a very likely chance that ultimately, humans will figure out the climate situation. It will eventually be solved. It's an existential problem. And if, say it's solved and we do that, but then we turn around and say, what happened to the biodiversity? Where's everything gone? And the reason it matters is because everything we require as a species is derived in some way or another from biological diversity. And for that I mean things like the air, and water and food and fuel and fiber, and all of these things. The conservation community has been trying very hard to make an economic case for what are the benefits, nature's benefits, and this sort of thing. And there's certainly a good case to be made for that. The fact is, our society would collapse without biodiversity. We wouldn't continue to survive. But there are other elements of biodiversity that provide us with value, and that's everything from spiritual and cultural value to entertainment, to all of these sorts of things. Most of us, if I make the argument to a politician, I say, you care about prosperity and security, and those sorts of issues, well then you should care about biodiversity. But if I ask most people, I think there's an innate connection people have with nature. I don't think you can separate, you shouldn't separate humans, from biodiversity. We're part of that. So there's this part of being human that is tied to biodiversity, and to the earth and to nature and the sense of wildness that we think or hope that exists in the world. And so I think there's an idea maybe we could manufacture our way through an absence of biodiversity. We could use all kinds of new engineering technologies and do something, but what would our life be like? What would the quality of the human experience be like without biodiversity? So, I think there's different arguments you can make. Fundamentally, though, I think it's more than just the economic argument. There's an intrinsic value in nature that sometimes gets ignored. In the conservation community, people are arguing with one another. Should we save nature because of its economic value in the landscape of in the Anthropocene, or is there a place for just nature as an intrinsic right? Do all other living things on Earth have the right to exist and to function without human interference or damage? It matters from across the spectrum, but I worry that we forget biological diversity. This idea that we're going to bring back species from the dead that are extinct, and so on, it's mostly a fantasy. So, we need work at both fronts. Let's fix climate change, work on that, but at the same time let's not lose these functioning ecosystems that humans require for their survival. I don't think you shouldn't separate, humans from biodiversity. We're part of that. Steve Monfort. David Skorton, I think some earlier point that you were making about indigenous cultures living that philosophy every day is very important. Steve Monfort, there was something else that was being discussed before. When you talk about individuals trying to take action and do things, most people that I've been talking to, we are increasingly bludgeoning them with gloom and doom, and we're not giving them any solutions. They keep saying, what can I possibly do? Well, what challenge? If you talk about the atmosphere, what more ephemeral thing are you asking people to do? They can make a choice. You can do all kinds of things personally, but at some level, I feel the right to a functioning atmosphere, clean air. Somebody said recently, to me, that's a basic human right. Clean air and clean water and food, those to me should be basic human rights. What are we going to do about maintaining those rights? There needs to be some role for the regulatory state, for governments. I think of California. They just went through their drought, and so they had mandatory water restrictions, and everybody went along with that because they knew, you run out of water, we're in big trouble. California is also an example of how they've regulated emissions. They've just said, you're not going to have a car here in this state unless it meets these requirements. So I do think there's both individual action, but also governments have to act for the benefit of everyone. So I think it's both. You have to have individual choice, and you have to have good governance and good decision-making. Bill McDonough was at the Earth Optimism Summit and he said, CO2 is the pollutant, and it's going into the atmosphere. And how would you think that people in Flint, Michigan, would feel if you said, you have lead in your water and it's at 100, let's say, units, and we're going to reduce it down to 40. Would you feel good about drinking water that only has 40 parts of lead in it instead of 100? It's the same way with the atmosphere and carbon dioxide. Anyway, if people looked at CO2 as a pollutant that was affecting their health, they might think of it differently. David Skorton, in the late 50s, the environment in Los Angeles was tough. As an asthmatic kid, there were many days where they said kids shouldn't go out to play, and so on. And a lot of changes were made predominantly through state-level regulations, although there was of course the Clean Air Act. I stepped in front of you, Jed, who wants to say something, but I can't resist asking Katrina where she comes on this issue, because threading that needle of how much to bring in regulation, how much to use a carrot and stick and so on, how much should be relegated to individuals, municipal, state, versus federal. It's one that we don't agree on as a country, and I'm curious, Katrina. Then I promise, Jed, I'll stop stepping on your minds and let you come in. Katrina Roark, I think that we've touched on two parts. This sort of individual call to action, what can an individual do, and what can the government do? I think this individual conversation is a really important one to have about how you feel like you participate in your community, however broadly you might define it. But everybody on Earth taking shorter, colder showers is not going to solve climate change. And then you can look at government policy. And government policy is maybe this opposite mechanism that dictates which actions are preferable or not allowable. Those instruments can be helpful. You can adapt them in a variety of ways, like market mechanisms to reduce acid rain were obviously quite helpful, and came in at a relatively low cost for all the achievements we made. But between those two is the marketplace. And every day, trillions of decisions are made in the marketplace. And right now, the vast majority of them don't think about climate change as a problem. They don't think about global problems as a problem.